On the night of July 12, 2024, a 42-year-old father named Matthew Restelli drove from California to a quiet house in American Fork, Utah, to get his wife and two young children. His wife had texted him that the front door would be unlocked. She told him to just walk in. But what Matthew didn't know was that his entire drive had been tracked by an AirTag hidden in his truck, and that the people monitoring his every mile were the same people who claimed to be his family. Matthew Clark Restelli was 42 years old, a handyman from California who could fix just about anything with his hands. He was the kind of guy who'd rather spend a Saturday rebuilding a fence than sitting still, and his mother Diane would later describe him as a devoted father, the type who got down on the floor with his kids and stayed there. He and his wife Kathryn had been married for about 7.5 years and had two young children together. And so when Diane had seen that her son was struggling with work around 2020, she'd bought a 7-acre property in the California desert for him, and later a manufactured home, so the young family would have a place to raise those kids. But the marriage between Matthew and Kathryn had always been rocky. Diane would later testify that Kathryn had a very hot and cold temperament, and that the relationship went through cycles of warmth and distance that left Matthew uncertain about where he stood. And so they pushed through it, the way couples sometimes do when there are children involved, because Matthew believed in the family he'd built, and he wasn't ready to give up on it. And then, roughly 3 weeks before that July night, something changed. Kathryn packed up the children without warning and drove from California to her mother's house in American Fork, Utah. She left the family truck parked miles from the house, forcing Matthew to bike through the darkness just to retrieve it. And so, when Matthew called his mother afterward, Diane said he sounded upset and confused, but not angry. He was worried about the kids. He wanted to know they were safe. What he couldn't have known was that this moment, this sudden departure, was not a woman fleeing a bad marriage. It was the first move in a plan that had been forming for months. Because Kathryn had not gone to Utah to think things over. She had gone home to her brother, Kevin Stanley Ellis, 33 years old, and to her mother, Tracey Grist, 59. And in the weeks that followed, something was being arranged inside that American Fork house that had nothing to do with reconciliation. Tracey had begun researching Utah's laws on shooting home intruders. She'd also been looking up the Donna Adelson case, a notorious 2014 murder-for-hire plot in Florida, where a family conspired to kill an ex-son-in-law. In one text message that investigators would later recover, Tracey described herself as a mama bear who was willing to strangle Matthew Restelli. But Matthew didn't know any of this. All he knew was that his children were hundreds of miles away, and their mother was finally talking to him again. In the days leading up to July 12th, Kathryn began reaching out to Matthew. She told him she wanted to work things out. She said she was ready to come home with the kids, but there was a problem, she explained. She couldn't rent a car because she didn't have an out-of-state credit card. Therefore, if Matthew wanted his family back, he would have to drive to Utah and come get them himself. And so Matthew got in his truck and started the long drive east. About 2 hours before he arrived, he called his mother, Diane. She said he sounded completely normal, calm even. He complained about bad food at a gas station and mentioned a pump that wouldn't work. He didn't sound like a man driving into danger. He sounded like a father driving to pick up his kids. But what Matthew didn't know was that long before he'd started his engine that morning, someone had hidden an AirTag inside his truck. The tracker was linked to the Apple IDs of 4 people, Kathryn, Kevin, Tracey, and one of Kevin's sisters. And so as Matthew drove east across the desert, through Nevada and into Utah, every mile he covered was being monitored in real time by the people waiting for him at the other end. Kathryn kept in contact throughout the drive, texting back and forth, keeping him calm, keeping him coming. She told him that when he arrived, the front door would be unlocked. Just let yourself in. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because inside that house, before Matthew had even crossed the state line, someone had already begun preparing. They put the children's toys away. They draped blankets over the couch. And Kevin Ellis loaded a gun that wasn't registered to him. Matthew Restelli pulled up to Tracey Grist's house in American Fork at approximately 10:15 p.m. on July 12th. He walked up to the front door, found it unlocked just as Kathryn had promised, and let himself in. His 2 young children were upstairs in a bedroom. He never made it to them. Minutes after walking through that door, before he even saw his wife, Matthew was shot 7 times. Kevin Ellis pulled the trigger. And then, after a 2-minute gap that investigators would later scrutinize, a 911 call was placed. But it wasn't Kevin or Kathryn who called first. It was a neighbor who had heard the gunshots. Tracey Grist called minutes later, telling the dispatcher that an intruder had broken into the house armed with a knife and that her son had shot the man in self-defense. But when police arrived and examined the scene, the self-defense story started falling apart. Matthew's body lay just inside the front entrance, with 8 bullet casings scattered across the living room floor. He had a single wound to the chest, 2 wounds in his back, and a bullet through his right wrist with both an entry and exit wound, and in his right hand there was a knife. But here's the thing. Matthew Restelli was left-handed, and the knife in his right hand was being held in the wrong position, with the blade facing toward himself rather than outward. The grip was unnatural, the handle pressing into his fingers in a way that no person actually holding a weapon would ever grip it. To the detective studying the crime scene photographs, it looked as though someone had pressed that knife into a dead man's hand. And that wasn't even the worst part. When investigators traced the knife, they found no record of Matthew purchasing it. But they did find that Tracey Grist had purchased a matching knife months earlier. Therefore, detectives began pulling apart the family's digital trail, and what they uncovered was devastating. The deleted text messages, the cleared search histories. Tracey's research into Utah break-in laws and the Adelson murder-for-hire case. The AirTag hidden in Matthew's truck linked to all 4 family members' Apple accounts. And then there was what Kathryn had done the day before the shooting, on July 11th, that shattered any doubt about premeditation. She had met with a divorce attorney, and during that meeting, she told the lawyer that there had been no physical abuse in the marriage. No violence, no threats, nothing. And yet, in the hours after the shooting, when police questioned her, Kathryn told them that Matthew was dangerously abusive and that the shooting was completely justified. The judge who later reviewed the evidence put it bluntly. Kevin Ellis was carrying someone else's unregistered gun inside a house where the family claimed they never even locked the front door. He shot a man 7 times. And then someone placed a knife in the dead man's wrong hand. The self-defense claim, the judge said, was not persuasive. And so this is what the final moments of Matthew Restelli's life looked like. He had driven for hours across the desert, thinking about his children, thinking about putting his family back together. 2 hours earlier, he had called his mother and sounded fine. Maybe tired, but hopeful. He pulled up to the house at 10:15, saw the front door unlocked just like Kathryn had promised, and walked in. The front entrance opened directly into the living room. The house would have been quiet. The children were upstairs, already tucked into a bedroom, and somewhere in that room, Kevin Ellis was waiting with a loaded gun, in a house where blankets had been laid across the furniture to catch the blood. Matthew likely had no more than a few seconds. The first bullet hit him in the chest. Then more came, 7 shots in rapid succession, the casings scattering across the floor around him. 2 rounds struck him in the back, which meant that at some point he had turned, perhaps trying to shield himself, perhaps trying to reach the door he just walked through. A bullet tore through his right wrist, and then he was on the ground, in the entryway of a house he had driven hundreds of miles to reach, and someone was walking toward him with a knife to press into his hand. He never saw his children that night. He never saw his children that night. He never saw Kathryn. The woman who had told him the door would be unlocked, who had tested him during the drive, who had kept him calm and kept him coming, was somewhere in that house while her brother pulled the trigger 7 times. The next morning, Kathryn told a friend, "It's okay. I'm happy." Kevin Ellis was arrested and charged with murder. He maintained it was self-defense, but in January of 2026, a jury found him guilty of murder, along with obstruction of justice and domestic violence in the presence of children. They did acquit him of conspiracy, apparently believing he may have been manipulated by his own family. His sentencing is scheduled for March 23, 2026. Kathryn Restelli pleaded guilty to murder and conspiracy. At her sentencing, she told the court, "My heart breaks for his children." Judge Roger Griffin was unmoved. He told her, "Your selfish actions show that you didn't love your children at all. You made them victims." She received 6 years to life, and a protective order was issued forbidding her from ever contacting her own children again. Their mother, Tracey Grist, goes to trial in April of 2026. Matthew's mother, Diane, addressed the court and said, "You stripped me of his presence. Your children will never experience this incredible father. Matt's death has created a massive hole in my heart." Matthew's brother Mark told Kathryn, "She took my brother. She took her children's father. She destroyed her children's future." Today, Mark is raising Matthew's 2 children alongside his own. And somewhere in a Utah prison, the mother who lured their father to his death is forbidden by court order from ever seeing them again.